Well, my name is Samer Shahata, and I teach Middle East politics here at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. And we are delighted to have Dr. Magda Kandil here with us tonight to speak about Egypt's economy post-January 25, challenges and prospects. And Dr. Kandil is currently the Executive Director and Director of Research at the Egyptian Center for Economic Studies in Cairo. Previously, she worked with the International Monetary Fund, where she held the positions of advisor to the executive director and senior economist. She was also a visiting scholar at the IMF Institute Research Department, and she has undertaken several academic and professional activities at a number of institutions, including being professor and chair of the Department of Economics at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, as well as holding professorial posts at Washington State University, Southern Illinois University, and the Justus-Liebig Universitat, Giessen, Germany. Is that correct pronunciation? Mm-hmm. Okay, aber all my Deutsch vergessen. Dr. Kandil has received a number of awards, including 3 citations of excellence for the highest quality rating by the ANBAR Electronic Intelligence. In 2000, she was ranked 344th among the top 500 economists in the world. In 2011, she was ranked 29, which is the top 1% based on the number of journal pages, weighted by the number of authors using data from thousands of economists. She's a member of the American Economic Association, the Canadian Economic Association, the Arab Society for Economic Research, and the Economic Research Forum, where she was elected as the first woman chair of the Economic Research Forum Research Fellows. She has published extensively on various topics, such as debt accumulation, public spending, price flexibility, exchange rate fluctuations, and macroeconomic policies. She received her PhD in economics from Washington State University, and with that, I'd like to welcome you here. We're very happy that you're here, and I think we're very interested in hearing about Egypt's economic future after the historic events of January and February. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank the Samer Shahata, Dr. Samer Shahata, and the Center for Contemporary Arabic Studies for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to address this wonderful group. And I thought in the context of this presentation is just to provide everyone a picture of the economy in Egypt leading up to the revolution and post the revolution, to try to put things in perspective regarding the recent challenges and the way forward as we try to get out of this bottleneck. As you probably know, we've been living since January 25 in a lot of instability in Egypt, and a lot of that is attributed to political, security, and economic factors. And in order to put things in perspective, when it comes to studying economics, we have to see where we were, what was wrong with the growth model that Egypt adopted before the revolution, and why this led to the kind of political upheaval that led to riots on the street and translated into the big public uproar that we saw on January 25. I think it's nice to look at some data. The idea of the data here is to look at the performance of the economy over time. Economists like to look at real GDP growth. That would indicate the addition to the volume of the output produced over time. And we usually look at this as an indicator of performance. So we look at the episode leading to the revolution. Since 2000, Egypt went through some periods of low growth, what we would consider low growth. And then starting 2002, 2003 in particular, there were initiatives and lots of drives to press ahead of economic reforms. And we should not be shy about saying that there were economic reforms. Maybe they did not produce the best results at large, but I think we can look at the misgivings of the model. But we have also to applaud the fact that this translated into higher growth, and this is the period where the Egyptian economy excelled. Where the growth rate easily increased from 3% all the way till we reach the pre-global financial crisis, and we see that the growth rate reached even something in the neighborhood of 7%. And then hit the global financial crisis. The global financial crisis sent a shock wave across the globe, and the Egyptian economy was part of this process. But luckily, I think we had the scope to intervene, and that translated into lower growth. No one could argue against this. But if we put this in a global context, the 4.7% that we pulled in terms of growth in the 2008-9, and then subsequently the 5.1% in the 2009-10, that indicates that the economy weathered the global financial crisis relatively well. And despite this growth model, I think people were not satisfied. They were not satisfied simply for one reason. The wealth was not trickling down, meaning when you slice the outcome of growth, I think most of it was going into the pockets or the wealth of individuals that probably would not exceed 20, 30%, whatever. But it was not distributed across the spectrum. And we can talk about why. What was wrong with the growth model that led to the fact that growth was, or wealth was not trickling down. But I wanted to draw your attention in this context to the fact that when the revolution hit, Egypt works with fiscal year data, which means when we look at, you would notice here on the horizontal axis 2010 and 11. This is the fiscal year span for Egypt, which starts from June 2000 July 2010 through June of 2011. So in this particular year, it's a bit tricky because it spans two different periods. The period before the revolution, where growth was going well, it was around 5.6% in the first half of the fiscal year. And then we had the revolution, and the economy went into a very big contraction and then stagnated for a while. So the second half of the fiscal year was very bad. But nonetheless, when you put the two together, I think all in all, the economy pulled 1.8% growth rate. So it doesn't look bleak, but it's not something to be excited about, particularly when you know that most of this growth is attributed to the period before the revolution. This picture illustrates the same point using quarterly data. And this is the point that I was trying to make regarding, these are the first 2 quarters of the fiscal year. So that would be the first quarter of the fiscal year in 2010-11. Which would start in June through October, and then the last quarter of the year. So you see that the growth rates for these quarters were very high. And then the first quarter after the revolution, this is the January through March of 2011, we had a big contraction, 4.2%. The country was shut down, there was no activity whatsoever. This translated into a big contraction in real growth. We were very concerned about the last quarter of the fiscal year, but luckily it didn't turn out to be a contraction. It turned out to be almost stagnant growth, 0% growth. So when we put all the 4 quarters together, the 5.5, 5.6, 4.2 negative growth, i.e. contraction, and 0%, that translated into 1.8% for the entire year. It's not bad, but I think what it concerns me is the forward-looking agenda. I think if we take this as what transpired, and given the magnitude of the political transformation, one could look at this and say, okay, maybe we're out of the woods. But I think what concerns me is where we are in terms of the direction of policies and challenges in the economy. Inflation is a big problem in Egypt. It's a high inflationary environment, and this has resulted in a lot of concerns. And I think a part of these concerns translated to what we saw in Tahrir Square on January 25. I think the worst episode for inflation in Egypt was around 2008, the summer of 2008. You probably remember, again, this is attributed to global conditions. There was a wave of the so-called food and fuel price shock that arrested the global economy, and as a result, inflation shot up with varying magnitudes, but Egypt did not have a modest share. It had quite a hefty inflation price to pay here, because inflation shot up to almost 25%. And when we tried to bring inflation down since then, you see that inflation is coming down, but the best we've achieved, it was in the earlier part of 2009, still very high, and then since then it has come up, and it's in the neighborhood of 10% for the most part. So this is a high inflationary environment. If you put it in a global context, it's high inflation. If you compare it to Egypt's trading partner, it's high inflation. If you start factoring in its impact on the cost of living, unless you're in a flexible environment where you can grow your income at a rate that exceeds inflation, most people have started to feel the pinch, meaning that the real value of their income has eroded because they could not keep up with the cost of living. I don't know what I did. Oh, okay. Okay, with respect to sources of growth, I think economists like myself, we like to slice the economy into the various components. So we would talk about how to stimulate the economy. We have private consumption, which you see that it's quite resilient in Egypt, and this is actually one of the biggest attraction of the Egyptian economy from investors' point of view. It's a large economy. Consumption has been resilient over time. And then you look at the public consumption. The public consumption is the part that is attributed to government spending on wages, on salaries, on subsidies, on buying goods and services. And this part has been complementary, but I think that the part that interests me the most is the investment part, because there has been a drive to grow investment over time, particularly during the years of high growth that the economy witnessed. We have net exports, which is the difference between exports and imports. But keep in mind that Egypt, despite the fact that we've been trying to stimulate exports, on net we're carrying a trade deficit. The trade deficit means that we have net exports with negative contribution to growth, meaning that we import more than we export. So there is a lot of potential to grow as far as the export momentum. So when we look at this, we say Egypt does not fall in the domain of export-led economies yet. I think there is still a lot of room to grow exports, but it does not fall in that domain yet. Here is another picture that reflects on drivers of growth, that reflects on the annual percentage change for the various components that I've referred to earlier. And you see here that before the food and fuel price shock, we had quite a bit of growth in consumption. This is private consumption. But I think the main drivers of growth around this time was the investment component and the export component. This was before the global financial crisis. So clearly the growth momentum was driven by these two components. Government spending, I think, has been risen, and I've referred to the fact that they needed to invoke a stimulus package when the global financial crisis hit. So we see that this reflected itself into an increase in government spending or public consumption. So that was an attempt to try to cope with or mitigate the impact of the crisis on the economy. Following in 2009-10, I think we noticed that investment, you see this is the worst episode for investment. This is when the global financial crisis hit. We see that investment had almost zero growth during this time. It recovered subsequently. Net exports was also negative, and then it recovered subsequently, meaning that we gained some momentum in exports compared to the previous period. It's also interesting to reflect on foreign receipts income. We keep hearing after the revolution that the economy has taken a big hit as far as, well, it's the biggest concern that we have at this point, international reserves. If you've been following the international reserves position, and this is the line of defense that the central bank has to defend the exchange rate of the pound compared to major currencies. We started with almost 36 billion US dollars back in January. Now it's down to about 22 billion US dollars. So we've been losing reserves, and part of that is attributed to the dry up in the major sources of foreign receipts for this economy. What are these major sources? We have tourism. tourism has picked up before the crisis, and I think it slowed down during the global financial crisis, and then during the last year, which is 10-11, I think it doesn't look like it took a big hit, but it actually did take a big hit. I keep referring to the fact that most of the improvement here was attributed to good tourism through December of 2010, before the revolution. After that, it was a negative. In terms, this is the dark blue bar. In terms of remittances, I think there has been also a surge in remittances. And surprisingly, this is the last bit of data we have for the economy, and that includes the 6 months after the revolution. You see here that remittances for the first time shot up and exceeded tourism receipts as the first source of foreign income for Egypt. So that was a bit of a good surprise for economists and for policymakers in Egypt. I think it's probably attributed to a drive to transfer a lot of money to the country. And maybe the situation in Libya and other neighboring countries have had also some impact in terms of transferring a lot of money. So that resulted in an improvement in remittances. But I think Suez Canal also improved. Suez Canal is probably attributed, or mostly attributed, to the traffic in the Suez Canal, and this is related very much to the global financial or the global conditions. So when the global economy slowed down, we noticed that the receipts of Suez Canal slowed down quite a bit, and they probably have not recovered. They say it's not bad, but I think we had better years before the global crisis. There isn't much we could do about it as far as domestic policies are concerned. This is more attributed to the size of trade, which is a function of the health of the global economy, because we charge on ships that pass through the Suez Canal. I think the part that concerns me and concerns everyone in Egypt is investors' confidence, and that includes domestic and foreign investors. If you look at the yellow bar, this is the direct investment on net. And you see that Egypt has been receiving quite a bit of foreign investment, particularly before the global financial crisis. We took a big hit after the financial crisis, or during and after the global financial crisis. But look what happened. This is in the last fiscal year. And it's mostly attributed to the 6 months after the revolution. I think actually if there is any positive component, it's probably the money that came in before the revolution. After the revolution, it has almost been stagnant. So you see that this is a big price that the economy has had to deal with post the revolution. In terms of the overall balance of payment, and I referred to the international reserve position, what determines the international reserve position is the relationship between Egypt and the rest of the world. And there are two components to that. One component is related to trade flows, remittances, tourism, and so forth. And this is what we record in the current account balance. And you notice that before the global financial crisis, we had the current account balance positive, and then it turned negative during the global financial crisis. And then in 2010 and 11, surprisingly, with the slowdown in the economy, imports did not grow as much, and exports improved on account of higher energy prices. I will refer to that at a later point. But the point to make here that we cannot blame, if we zero in on the 10-11 data, we cannot blame the current account deficit for what happened and the loss of international reserves, because actually the deficit shrank compared to the previous year. But where the problem lies is in the light blue bar. This is what we call the financial account. And what's in the financial account? It includes the foreign direct investment, which slowed down significantly, and it includes portfolio flows. And these are inflows and outflows. And on net, Egypt has been losing these flows, meaning capital flight has increased post the revolution. So as a result, when we look at the financial account, it became a negative gap. And when you add the two together, that gives us the balance of payment position, which gives us a big deficit, almost 10 billion US dollars, which is the mirror image of the loss of international reserves at the central bank. So the country has been losing international reserves, and it's mostly attributed to the money that has been flying out of the country since the revolution, and the fact that FDI flows have slowed down significantly. Here's another way to look at this. It just shows the progression of in billion of US dollars of the various sources. You see tourism that has been rising over time from 4 billion US dollars, and it reached in its best year something around $12 billion or so, and it slowed down in the last year, the last fiscal year, primarily because of what happened post the revolution. If we look at remittances, you see also an increase, a surge in remittances, and as I indicated before, remittances for the first time exceeded tourism as the first source of foreign receipts in the balance of payment for Egypt. FDI, you see that FDI has been rising steadily, but they took a big hit during the global financial crisis and slowed down significantly post the revolution. This is the yellow line here that shows the deterioration post the revolution. And then you have the green line, which is the Suez Canal. So when you look at it, you can see what is the relative importance of the various sources. Suez Canal is not the best source of foreign receipts for income, but because we've lost quite a bit of FDI, relatively speaking, it has helped to sustain some of the foreign receipts sources for Egypt post the revolution. Here's another picture about the financial account. The financial account reflects what's going on with the two components that I referred to, and what is considered good and what is considered bad. In terms of FDI flows, I think this is the kind of investment that we would like to attract over time. And this is what we are trying hard at this point to attract back, because we had the best years before the revolution, slowed down significantly. Hot money or portfolio flows, by their nature, they are hot, they come in and go quickly. So we see that we benefited quite a bit with a big surge, or by a big surge, in these inflows before the revolution, but this was the money that was very quick to reverse course after the revolution. So we see that after the revolution, this money left the country quickly. So you see this big drop in the outflow. This is attributed to the capital flight that I referred to. And then we talk about economic policies. What has been happening and how does this affect the economy? We have fiscal policy, which is what the government does, and we have the fiscal deficit, which is the result of what the government does. Economic theory suggests that when we constrain, or when we try to consolidate, meaning to shrink the deficit, that helps the economy. And we see a testimony of this using Egypt data. Here's the deficit, and you see that the deficit was as wide as 10% at one point. And then during the episode, when there was a drive to consolidate and shrink the deficit, we see that we've managed to shrink the deficit. And then the mirror image of that are the results in terms of real growth. So you see that the green line here, real growth, picked up as we consolidated the deficit, meaning as we shrank the fiscal deficit, that paid off in terms of higher real growth. Particularly if we zero on the private component of real growth, which is the top line, the blue line, you see that there is a surge here in growth, and this slowed down more recently. But the surge in growth here corresponds to the period when the government was trying to reduce the fiscal deficit. And what's the relationship? The government is borrowing mostly domestically in Egypt, and it's a very high rate, and it mops up the liquidity that exists in the banking system. So when this happens, this has a negative impact on private sector activity. The episodes when the government was trying to reform public finance and reduce the fiscal deficit, it paid off in terms of higher growth rates, and particularly for the private sector. And this is why we're very concerned about the recent trend. And what's the recent trend? You look at the deficit line here, and you see that there has been a widening in the fiscal deficit. It's coming back to where it was before, almost 10% before the revolution. This has been the result of the revolution, and most of that is the drive by the government to accommodate the growing social agenda that has risen post the revolution. So you see that there has been a wider fiscal deficit. The impact of this, of course, is lower growth. The impact of this, lower private sector activity, and this is why we're very much concerned about this. Why are we concerned about this? Debt, public debt. And I think we live in an environment where we've started seeing the problems with public debt in major economies and in other economies in the euro area, in Greece and in Italy. And in the case of Egypt, we're very concerned about the wider fiscal deficit, because this would amount, after we've had some drive to try to consolidate the deficit and to reduce the debt, we see now that the public debt is rising again relative to GDP. Luckily, in the case of Egypt, most of the debt is domestic debt. This is the top line, compared to the smaller part, which is external debt. That reflects a drive by policies at one point to concentrate borrowing in the domestic market in order to reduce pressure on the exchange rate. Unfortunately, this has become excessive, and it's not sustainable, because right now, most of the borrowing is in the domestic market. And most of the borrowing is at a very high rate, almost 14%. And this is slowing down the liquidity that could be made available to the private sector. So it has a lot of negative impact on private activity. And on the other hand, we have also an issue with the depletion of international reserves, which may not be sustainable going forward. I think the continued depletion of the international reserve is very worrisome regarding the ability to defend the exchange rate going forward. In terms of the other component of policies, monetary policy is the other macro policy that we usually look at in order to see how they can help the economy. Monetary policy in Egypt was trying at one point, this is during the episode when they tried to help during the global financial crisis, they had an easing cycle. By lowering the interest rate, there was a deliberate drive to try to stimulate the economy. Since September 2009, the monetary policy in Egypt has been neutral, meaning the two policy rates have not been adjusted. Why? I think the central bank is stuck in a very difficult situation. Even before the revolution, they were hesitant to try to raise the interest rate. Usually when there is a wave of inflation, the central bank would rush to raise the interest rate in order to stem inflationary pressure. But when the economy is weak, they're very reluctant to do so. And that was the case even before the revolution, despite the fact that in summer of 2010, there was a wave of high inflation in Egypt. Usually there are price shocks attributed to vegetable prices, attributed to fruit prices, and they create a lot of anxiety regarding inflationary pressures. Nonetheless, the central bank did not or resisted any temptation to raise the interest rate because they were concerned that this could end up slowing economic recovery. They wanted to sustain the recovery before the revolution. Now they are stuck in a more difficult situation. The economy tanked after the revolution. Government took charge, the government is borrowing. They are trying to revive private sector activity, which has been adversely affected by the revolution in a variety of ways. This is not the right environment to raise the interest rate. And at the same time, there are signs of inflationary pressure. So they are stuck in between two evils. On one hand, inflation is high. On the other hand, growth is very low. And I think right now they are trying to stay neutral just to preserve the momentum. But frankly, what I feel that the central bank is under extreme pressure because the fiscal policy is dominant in this environment. And it's very difficult for the central bank to maintain its objectives regarding controlling inflation in an environment where the government is excessively borrowing, and most of what the government is spending on is consumption-based spending, whether it's wages and salaries increases, subsidies increases, compensation increases. All of this is considered consumption-based spending, and that creates more inflation and makes it difficult for the central bank to resist the pressure on the exchange rate because we have a high import component of our consumption. So every time you give people more money, and most of the people receiving the money, they have a high tendency to consume. The marginal propensity to consume is very high. So when they take the money, they go out and buy goods and services. That translates into inflationary pressure. But there is a good component of what people buy that is important, particularly food items. So that increases the pressure on the exchange rate because that increases the import bill at a time when the sources of foreign receipts are still very weak at best. And then we look at what's happening. I kept saying I don't like the deficit, and we advise the government to consolidate. It's not a good model for growth. stimulating and so forth. This is an evidence of what's going on with credit indicators. When we go to the banking sector and we tell them, whom are you lending to? And we see that the credit growth, this is the assets on the asset sides of the banking system, we see that this credit growth has been shrinking. And it has been shrinking primarily to the private sector. This is the green line here. That shows what's happening. I'd like for you to zero in on this cross here towards the end. What has been happening since the revolution? Most of the credit has been going to finance government operations. So this is credit to the public sector. At the same time, credit to the private sector has been shrinking. This is why we're very alarmed by the increased government borrowing, because it means that they take away the liquidity that could be made available to the private sector. This is not going to be conducive to help private sector operation. Nonetheless, I cannot claim that banks are running out of cash. To the contrary, they're sitting on tons of cash. If you look to the indicator, the loans to deposit ratio, you see that this ratio used to be 60%. It used to be even higher at earlier episode. But more recently, this has been declining. This means that banks are sitting on excess cash. They are only loaning something in the neighborhood of less than 50% of their deposits. So what are they doing with the rest of these deposits? They're sitting watching these deposits. Are they losing money? No. When I look at the bank's balance sheets, they're making tons of profits. It's one of the best paying sectors in Egypt. They pay high salaries, top premium salaries for their personnel and so forth. So how can they afford that? If you go deposit your saving in a bank in Egypt, you get at best 8% or whatever. If they take this money and buy government securities, they are lending the government 14%. So at the 50%, they are making a killer. The spread is almost 6%, so they don't care. They can sit and cross their legs and watch the rest of the liquidity. And who is suffering in this environment? It's the private sector. And the government is not helping by increasing borrowing and excessively borrowing in the domestic market. Okay, now on to some of the elements that contributed to what we saw in Tahrir Square, the labor force and unemployment. We talked about the fact that we had episodes of high growth. I think it's interesting to watch what's going on between the light blue and the dark blue. The dark blue is the growth in the labor force. Mostly, this is attributed to demographic factors in Egypt. Our estimate that based on demography, there are about 700,000 entrants to the labor market in Egypt on a yearly basis. That's based on demography, the growth in the labor force, and so forth. That means that the country, in order to reduce unemployment, you need to create at least 1 million jobs a year, because you have 700,000 that are seeking jobs for the first time, in addition to those who have been out of work for some time. When you look at what is going on over time, we had some success reducing unemployment, particularly during the episode when the economy was growing and the private sector in particular was growing. We had quite a bit of growth here in employment that exceeded the labor force. And because it exceeded the growth of the labor force, that translated into a reduction in the unemployment rate. But since 2008, you see the cross of the two lines here, it switched. The dark blue line is on top of the light blue line since 2008. And what happened in 2008? It's the global financial crisis. The government took charge of the economy. The government put in a stimulus package that helped preserve the growth rates. We saw a 4.7% growth rate. We saw a 5.1% growth rate. Nonetheless, the job content of growth was very weak. Public investment did not succeed in creating jobs. And we see this clearly, that unemployment has been rising in the Egyptian economy since 2008. And this is at the time when the global financial crisis hit, and that led to the frustration and so forth. And unemployment, even though when you look at these data, you think, well, unemployment in Egypt is around 12%. This is a very disguised picture, because unemployment among college graduates is the highest. You talk about 35% unemployment. among the college graduates group. So that, and there is a lot of informality, I must say. There are a lot of jobs that are being created in the informal market. So these are not counted because they are very vulnerable. They do not have any bonding contracts and so forth. These are some data that reflects the distribution of income. If you look at the top, income shared by the highest 10% of the population, it's almost, this is 10 times the income shared by the lowest 10% of the population. So that gives you some feel for the magnitude of this disparity in terms of the distribution of income. Even if you look at the 20th percentile at the top, at the bottom, you find that the gap is almost 5 times between the income that's shared by the top or the highest 20% of the wealthiest people in the society compared to the lowest 20%. So that suggests that there is quite a bit of disparity, and the poverty indicator is very high. I think these estimates are probably moderate. Some estimate would put poverty at even a higher rate in Egypt. Regardless, I think the story to tell here that all of these factors translated to what we saw in Tahrir Square and translated into the kind of frustration that we saw then. The point here to make is what happened since then. The economy has taken a big hit. Investors have been very much concerned about the direction of economic policies, about the lack of political stability, about the lack of security, about the continued violence on the street. We've been downgraded, and the most downgrades are by the Standard & Poor's and by Moody's. That this reflects a lack of confidence in the management of the economy, in fiscal operation. So this is likely to increase even the cost of borrowing on the government. This is a picture of what happened in the stock market. Most of the gains that the stock market achieved during 2010, they have been lost through 2011 or for the most part of 2011 since the revolution. So that gives you a reflection of what's going on, which is the mirror image of the anxiety, and that reflected itself on the stock market. Disruption of economic activity, if we look at the indicators, what is likely to sustain this economy going forward? Domestic investment took a big hit. As a share of GDP, it used to be 19.5%. Now it's slowed down to 17% of GDP, and it could be even slower in the current fiscal year, which goes through June of 2012. This is only 15.2%. The domestic saving rate took a big hit, and most of that is attributed to government borrowing, because domestic saving rate would include public and private savings, and the government saving rate is negative. Every time they increase current spending and they do not have revenues, that means that they are dissaving. And this reflected itself in a big reduction in the saving rate. Foreign direct investment, which I referred to from the best year, which was not the best year we saw. I think we had much better performance than that. But if we take a look at the benchmark before the global financial crisis, 6.8 billion US dollars, that slowed down to 2.2 billion in the past fiscal year, and given the anxiety that we've been going through, it could be even slower in the next fiscal year. The fiscal policy response, we've been seeing and observing what the transition government has been doing since they took charge of the economy. I think they've opened the gate to accommodate a lot of demands that have grown, and maybe many of these demands are legitimate in terms of increases in wages and salaries, in terms of compensation, in terms of even hiring temporary employment in the state sector, which is already stocked up with 6.6 million Egyptians working there, subsidies that have increased. All of this translated into a lot of expenses for the government, and this has been the style that they followed since the revolution, which raises a lot of concern about their management of public finance, which is not sustainable. It reflects on the debt, it reflects on the cost of borrowing, it's not helping to revive the economy, and at the same time it has provided a wave of growing expectations that have been endless since the revolution. So every time we look around, we see another demonstration asking for more demands and so forth. This have reflected itself on the public finance situation, on the projection for the deficit. Is there a scope to reform public finance? Yes, there is. Most of the discussion these days are focused on subsidies reform. Government spending in Egypt is occupied with subsidies. It's the largest component of government spending. Most of these subsidies are going in the form of price subsidies. And food subsidies is the small component. If you look at here, the food subsidies is the lower part here. But the part that has been growing is the fuel subsidies. The fuel subsidies, it occupies more, almost 8% of GDP is going to fuel subsidies. And who are the beneficiaries of these fuel subsidies? Mostly the wealthy, those who can afford to consume more energy. Usually your consumption of energy increases with the level of income. So this is untargeted subsidies. And that provides a scope to reform public finance. And this is what we've been arguing for. And fortunately, we've been hearing some rhetoric recently from high-ranking government officials that they are going to attack fuel subsidies, that they would like to institute a system of a better targeted fuel subsidies. They've started already scaling down fuel subsidies on energy-intensive industries. That includes ceramics, cement, fertilizers. These are business people that are making lots of profits. Nonetheless, they were getting subsidized fuel. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense for the government to borrow at a very expensive rate in order to finance subsidies. And most of these subsidies are going to the wealthy people or to energy-intensive industries. This is not sustainable. This is a picture of what I would like to refer to regarding 75%. That's 75% of government spending in Egypt is occupied by three categories. The largest of which are subsidies. This is the green bar here. This is the largest spending component. And then we have wages and salaries, which is about 25% of government spending. And interest expenditures. This is the cost of servicing existing debt by the government. If you add these together, they account for 75% of total spending. Is there a room to scale this down? You cannot do much about wages and salaries. These are people that are already employed in the state sector, whether they are productive or not. I think they will continue to get their wages and salaries because you cannot let go of this in this environment, and you have to create alternatives, and the economy is not ready for that. Interest payment, again, it's imposed upon you. You cannot do much about it. This is the cost of continuing to borrow at a very high rate. So where is the room to reform public finance? It's in this monster that has been growing over the years. You need to establish a system of targeted subsidies, making sure that these subsidies go to those who deserve it. I think this is the biggest violation of social justice, that the first budget announced after the revolution contains 1/3 of government spending that is locked up in subsidies that are not targeted. And most of these subsidies are going to the rich and the well-to-do in the Egyptian economy. That defies any principle of social justice, and it's high time to put this at the top priority of reforming public finance. This is a pie that shows you the 2011 or 10-11, the most fiscal year, and it shows the components. The 32% is going to subsidies, the 24% is going to wages and salaries, 22% is going to the payment on interest payment, and then you have 10%, only 10% for investment, for a government that has a lot to do in terms of investment, and other expenditures are the remaining component. So you see these three big blocks and how they take up most of the space. That diverts away a lot of resources. I think the government needs more resources to spend on the social agenda. I think they need to do more subsidies, but not price subsidies. They need to do education subsidies, production subsidies, agricultural subsidies. The economy needs a lot of subsidies, but there is no fiscal space. And we cannot keep adding more spending, and this is what they've been doing since the revolution. In the name of the social agenda, putting more and more layers of additional spending on top of already a lot of waste, and it has become unsustainable. So it's not helping, it's elusive. I cannot tell people that I'm raising the minimum wage when in fact the cost of raising the minimum wage is costing the government to borrow, and it's creating inflation. So whatever I'm promising the person in terms of higher wages is being eroded by the inflation. So it's very elusive. This reflects on the progression of the revenues, which has taken a big hit in 2010 and 11. Expenditures have increased, particularly in the current budget, 11-12. And the overall deficit, which has widened. It widened last year. This is a fact, a 9.6%. It is what transpired, and it's mostly owing to the increase in spending post the revolution. This is deprojected, although most likely, given the patterns of spending, that the 8.6% will be exceeded. And to put things in perspective, you see what's going on with the fiscal indicators. You see that the revenues have been shrinking, and at the same time, the expenditures have been rising over time. And this is reflecting itself in the wider deficit that we've been seeing over time. So this is a reflection of the need to consolidate, meaning shrink expenditure. There is a room to reform expenditure and grow revenues in order to keep up with the increasing commitment. That's another illustrative way of making the same point. If you look at revenues to expenditures over time, you see that this ratio has been shrinking over time, meaning that expenditures have been growing at a faster rate, much faster rate compared to revenues. So as a result, there is a big reduction in this revenue, the share of revenue to expenditures, which used to be around 80%, and it's declining significantly more recently. The external sector, the current account deficit, we talked about this. What happened post the revolution? Actually, it was a nice surprise that the current account deficit, which was in the neighborhood of $4.3 billion in the fiscal year 9-10, in the past fiscal year, this is post the revolution, it shrank, the deficit shrank to $2.8 billion. So what are the sources of these? Egypt is an energy exporting economy, and as a result, oil exports have seen quite a bit of increase. And most of that is attributed to the big increase in the energy price. So we've benefited from the increase in the energy price. Non-oil exports also, positively, surprisingly, it did not turn out to be in the negative territory. I think to the contrary, it increased somewhat. But as a share of total exports, the non-oil exports shrank from 57% to 55%. Foreign direct investment remains very dismal, $2.2 billion. And the bigger problem, as we've talked about, is the outflow. Remittances held up very well. They increased. This is the increase we've seen in remittances from 10 billion, a little over 10 billion US dollars to 13 billion US dollars. Most of that is attributed to private remittances, people like ourselves transferring money back to Egypt, or Libyan workers or Egyptian workers working in Libya and transfer money back to the country. Tourism, however, took a big hit, and there was a contraction in the receipts attributed to tourism by about 8.65% in the past fiscal year. What happened as a result? I think there is a lot of intervention and efforts by the central bank to intervene, to accommodate the increasing demand for dollar, for foreign exchange, given the depletion of the natural sources of foreign income. If you look at what happened as far as the exchange rate, despite the fact that usually if you do not do anything and you keep your reserves and you hold on the 36 billion US dollars you had in your reserves, the impact of this would be big depreciation in the exchange rate. So the fact that the central bank has been accommodating the rising demand by pumping in more international reserves and more dollars into the system, this is the $12 billion they've lost, that somehow contained what could have been a bigger depreciation of the currency. So what we're seeing here, despite the efforts of the central bank to contain the pressure on the depreciation pressure on the exchange rate, the pound has depreciated. It has depreciated at 3% relative to the dollar, maybe more relative to major other currencies such as the British pound or such as the euro. So at the end, there is a depreciation, and this depreciation is worrisome. It's worrisome because it means inflation, because Egypt has a high import bill. On the other hand, I think the current situation is also more worrisome because the central bank accommodated the demand, but I think they're running out of steam. When you reach 22 billion US dollars, speculators could easily enter this market because they feel that the central bank may not be able to keep up with this momentum of trying to defend the currency. So they could increase their demand for dollarization simply because everybody is expecting that there could be another wave of depreciation of the pound. So that creates artificial demand for the dollars and hoarding on dollars in anticipation of what is likely to be depreciation as the central bank runs out of steam. This is a picture of what has happened regarding the depreciation of the pound relative to the euro. This is on the right-hand scale, and relative to the dollar, which shows the continuous depreciation, meaning that you have to offer more pounds in exchange for the major currencies. The monetary policy response to the crisis, I think the central bank tried to weather the shock initially well, and the banking system remained resilient. They did not have any problem with cash. They did not have any problem with even dollarization. So that somehow helped. But I think at the same time, the concern is about inflationary pressures. Inflation is likely to pick up on a variety of fronts. First is the depreciation of the pound that I've alluded to. This is likely to have a lot of pass-through into the economy because we have a high import content of our consumption. Recovery in the global economy is like, if it's sustained, although there are some ifs and buts at this point, that could also raise international prices, and this is likely to be passed on to domestic prices in Egypt. We have also the lingering instability where the production side of the economy remains very weak. At the same time, what we're seeing that the consumption side of the economy started to gain back some momentum. Egyptians maybe had 3 months after the revolution of weak consumption patterns and so forth, but subsequently they went back and started resuming their consumption pattern. So what we're seeing now is a drive to consume. Purchasing power is in place. At the same time, the production side of the economy is very weak. So if we put all of this together, and we would like to advise the government and try to put a story for what happened and where do we go from here. Clearly, the growth model that we saw before the revolution paid off in some respects, but it was not inclusive. It was only shared, or the fruits of which were only shared by 20-30% of the population. And why was that? There are two factors attributing to that. First, the job content of growth was very, very small, meaning that when you are growing, the value added was clustered in transactions or in sectors that did not create a lot of jobs, particularly in the formal market. Secondly, it was not a level playing field for the private sector. Big investors benefited the most in this environment. They knew how to play the system. They capitalized on their ties and connections to the political regime, and that resulted in a very much concentration in terms of lending, in terms of access to credit. That did not create a level playing field. The small and medium enterprises in Egypt constitute about 80% of the economy is in the form of small and medium enterprises. Despite the fact that we subscribe to private-led growth, that component of the economy was suffering before the revolution. They go to a bank to get a loan, they could not get a loan. They were not considered bankable. The institutional structure was not supportive of their operation. The cost of starting a business, the cost of hiring, the type of collaterals they had to present, a number of hurdles. So they did not fare well in that environment. And as a result, the wealth did not trickle down. When you have 80% of the so-called private sector of the economy that are lagging behind, there is no way you can spread the wealth. So you end up benefiting the component of the private sector that knew how to play the system, the 20%. So what's the way forward? I think we need to go back. I, for one, and given all the fiscal indicators that I've shared with you here, I would be very much concerned about continuing the model that we've seen since the revolution. And what has this model been? It has been focused on additional government spending to accommodate social demands. This is not sustainable. This is very inflationary. This is creating a lot of pressure on the exchange rate. This is taking away liquidity from the banking system. So I would say to the government, enough. I think you need to scale back your spending. You need to reform your public finance. I'm not against social spending, but create the space. You cannot institute minimum wage policy before you institute the highest wage order to try to reform the pay scale, to provide the space so you reallocate the resources from top to the bottom. You need to reform the subsidy system in order to create the space to keep up with the social agenda. So the government needs to scale down the waste that they have in their operation in order to create the resources to keep up with the growing commitments they have. They need to spend more on the vulnerable groups. They need to spend more on education. They need to spend more on health services. They need to spend more on infrastructure. There are so many things that are needed from the government. Because the government does not have the resources, they are not doing this well. They have a lot of waste, so they need to clean up their operation, reform the public finance. And they need to continue subscribe to the private-led growth. But they need to do it right. If I were to advise them in this current difficult political environment, and this is a transition government, there are three things that I would advise them to do that I think would be manageable and acceptable politically. Reform of the public finance, particularly targeting subsidies. I think a lot of people in Egypt are very much against the current subsidy system, and they think it's not sustainable and it entails a lot of waste. So they would be very much in favor of reforming the subsidy system, particularly for fuel. So this is a top priority. Secondly, I think they need to have a proactive agenda to help these small and medium enterprises. I think this is the component of the economy that can be stimulated at this point. Big investors have escaped, domestic and foreign. Are they going to come back soon? I don't think so. They can say whatever announcement they care to say at this point. I think we have the election around the corner, the 28th of November. It may not conclude and finish till March. After that, we're going to go into a constitution writing for another 6 months. Presidential election may not be held till 2013. There is a lot of uncertainty. But the biggest uncertainty investors have is about the first stage of the parliamentary elections, which will be held on the 28th of November. They need some big news. They need reassurance. What they've been seeing since the revolution has not been assuring as far as investment is concerned. A lot of money flew out of the country because of these concerns. And a lot of money is on standstill because of these concerns. So we need to work on these concerns, but it's going to take a while. But where is the part of the economy that we can stimulate at this point? It's the small and medium enterprises. These are people that are struggling to make ends meet. These are people that could be unemployed, and they need to get off the unemployment line and start their own business. These are people that are looking to have access to credit to start their business in order to have food on the table. So for them, it's a must. It's making living. And I think they could be stimulated. And I think this is what we should be investing on as a first priority in the near term, within this current political structure, and the government could afford that. Thirdly, I think the government needs to capitalize on a lot of international pledges that have been made available to the Egyptian government. The VIL initiative, I've heard $35 billion that are targeted to help the Egyptian economy. But most of this money is not cash. There is very little money that the government could receive or has been receiving in terms of cash assistance. Most of these pledges are in the form of projects. And when you sit down with donors, they tell you, we need the action plan. We need the government to put forward the projects. We need to align our support in order to transfer the money into specific projects. So this is another area where the government needs to focus on. I think this is very important in order for them to take aim at the priorities. We keep forgetting that people who went out on the street to demonstrate on the 25th of January, they were looking for two things: jobs, employment, particularly for the youth, and containing the cost of living. Have we been addressing this since the revolution? I'm afraid that there is almost no scope for the government to create jobs in the state sector, in the public sector. They already have 6.6 million people. They've tried to hire some people on a temporary basis, but if we remind ourselves that we need to create 1 million jobs a year, there is no way for the state to create these jobs. They've been borrowing, they don't have the revenues, it's not a very rich oil country, so this model is not sustainable. So when can they create the jobs? They have to create them in the private sector, but which private sector? It's the private sector that would make the wealth trickle down. So we have to invest in small and medium enterprises and leave big investors to come slowly after they get the kind of assurance they would like to get: political stability, security, and whatnot. But for the time being, it's small and medium enterprise. You need to focus on this in order to bring the economy back on track, in order to address the social concerns, and you need to scale down the type of waste that exists in fiscal operation because it's inflationary. The worst thing we would be doing is to enter this vicious cycle of spending to increase minimum wages, create inflation, and then a year from now we would be talking about another minimum wage because what we had just instituted is not adequate. So it's elusive. You have to preserve the value of money. You have to do this through the right economic management, and the government is at the center stage of doing this. So we need to help the central bank to contain inflation. And the only way to do this is by trimming the waste of government spending in order to avail more resources. They need to spend more on the social agenda. There is a lot of priorities that have been stated and should take the top priority. We can talk about education, we can talk about more support to the vulnerable groups, we can talk about the need to invest in infrastructure in order to attract investors and so forth. This is very, very important. On the revenue side of the fiscal operation, I think there is room to improve the tax collection, the revenue collection. They've already increased the tax rate. We did not have a progressive tax system before the revolution. It was a flat tax at 20%. Post the revolution, they've introduced a new category, a new tax rate. This is the 25% for those who make more than 10 million Egyptian pound a year. I think there has been a lot of discussion about progressive taxes. Maybe there is room to institute progressive taxes, but I would be very hesitant to advocate this in this environment. I think the economy is very weak. So the worst thing we could do in the name of boosting revenues is to go kill the goose in order to increase the revenues. We're not going to be able to do this till we fix the economy. So I would put it on the back burner for the time being and focus on efficiency in tax collection. The fact of the matter, there is a lot of avoidance. There is inefficiency in tax collection. This year, luckily, and again, fortunately, because people have become so concerned about all these charges about corruption and what have you, all of a sudden we have 12% increase in tax collection. So that reflected itself positively. Nonetheless, when you look at the Egypt and where is the tax revenue relative to GDP, you see that Egypt is not ranked very well among the other countries in terms of tax revenues as a percent of GDP. So there is a lot of room to grow revenues, and I think this should be a top priority. But there are other venues to increase revenues. They've started reviewing the gas contract with Israel and Jordan. I think they've concluded the deal with Jordan already. I think real estate taxes, I'm very much in favor because there is a lot of dead capital. And we were concerned about the 50% deposit sitting in the banking system. If you go around Cairo, suburban Cairo, and along the Red Sea and along the Mediterranean Sea, lots of homes that are vacant, that are not occupied. I view this to be dead capital. And if you institute some form of property taxes, you can get more value added out of these investments. So instead of having this as a way of accumulating wealth over time, you can get some return for the economy by renting it out, by selling it out, by transacting it. So there will be some activity attributed to them. Monetary policy should be focused on containing inflation and preserving the exchange rate. The biggest risk we have right now is the loss of international reserves. I don't know where we stand vis-a-vis the deal with the IMF. I know we said no 4 months ago, but it seems like we're going back to the drawing table now, and there seem to be some flare in the air suggesting that there could be an imminent deal to go back to the lending or borrowing from the international institutions. This is badly needed because it's needed to provide a boost for fiscal operation, to reduce the drain on the economy, to reduce the cost of borrowing domestically, and to boost international reserves. So we hope that this will work out in order to give the monetary policy an ability to weather the pressure on the exchange rate. But frankly, no matter what, we need to bring the stability back, in order to bring tourists back, in order to bring FDI back, in order to increase our natural sources of foreign receipts. This is what we need in order to sustain the exchange rate going forward. The structure agenda, we could go on and on about what's needed. Clearly, the education system in Egypt is a big failure. When you have college graduates that cannot find jobs, when you look at the specialties, when you look at the demand by the private sector and the fact that sometimes they cannot find the right applicant, when you look at vocational training and how much it has deteriorated over the years, I think there is a need to overhaul the education system, to look at the curriculum, to look at the specialties, to look at what is needed, to match the demand with the supply. There is also a lot of rigidity in labor laws. Most of the hiring in the private sector, when it was booming, it was in the informal economy. So we need to fix the problems with this rigidity in labor laws in order to increase formality and reduce vulnerability in the labor market. So to conclude here, the social inequality has been a big problem that existed in a growing economy. It was shameful to see the kind of poverty, the kind of struggle that people had in a growing economy. If we did not have the wealth, I think that would have been a different story. There would have been an excuse. But when the economy is growing and it's producing a lot of results, nonetheless, the wealth is clustered in the pockets of a few individuals. That's what made it very tough, and what made it very intimidating. And it was not, and even from an economic point of view, forget about the political right. Was that a model for growth to sustain? Probably not. I showed you the data. The only thing that sustained growth in Egypt over time was consumption. And in order to sustain consumption, you need to invest in your people. And you need to give them jobs, and you need to keep up their real income with the cost of living. But if you fail to do that, you're eroding your consumption basis. And it would have come to a halt, even without the revolution. Because investors need this momentum in terms of additional spending and additional consumption in order to keep pumping in money. So this model would not have been sustained regardless of what happened. But I think we hope that the priorities, we keep talking about the social agenda, and I keep saying the social agenda is nothing but finding jobs, creating jobs, and containing the cost of living. So I hope that the government would invest in the private sector. I think we should not shy away from the necessary support for the private sector. And I have to say that some of these slogans have become very difficult to advocate. It's very difficult to advocate private-led growth. It's very difficult to advocate capitalism because people only remember the bad sides of these slogans and the bad sides of these ideology. But we need to institute the regulations, and we need to show the good sides of these policies. And it's a must because the state does not have the resources to maintain the environment otherwise and to sustain the economy going forward. And they need to have a forward-looking agenda. We hope the election results will bring stability and would bring some reforms so the government would focus on the longer-term agenda. Most of the debate in Egypt has been focused on the political process, and it's high time for them now to settle down and establish some political stability so they can start thinking about what's necessary to build the economy going forward and the type of reforms that should be instituted and the type of legislative reforms that should be instituted to help the economy going forward. I thank you very much, and I hope I did not take a lot of time. But,
Dr. Kandil, thank you so much for impressively comprehensive and impressively also data rich. I don't think I've seen so much data presented in this room for a number of years. So thank you for that. And if you have time, it would be nice to entertain some questions from the floor if there are some.
Sure.
So we'll first go to Soon. And then
Joseph Soon, I teach here. Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. You talked about the job and the unemployment as one of the main aspects, but the reality is also it's going to be very, very hard to reform the subsidies given all the political factors that are going on now. But even if you look over for the next 2-3 years, let us assume and hope that tourism goes back to the level it was. Do you really see that the private sector, the small and medium size, can hire to such an extent to reduce unemployment in a substantial way? And a totally different question. In your numbers before, where did aid fit into the balance of payments and the fiscal and the total overall numbers of the deficits? Did it ever help in the model of growth that was pre-revolution, the aid?
Or the foreign aid.
The foreign aid. Thank you.
Would you like
should we
to
take a couple of them? Okay, why don't we take there was a question in the back.
I was curious what you believe the prospects are for Egypt's recovery, economic recovery, if the government, given the flurry that there's been, these discussions of perhaps them going back to the IMF, if they decide not to take that loan, because I guess that would be something like $3 billion, and what you think the likelihood of them facing a financial crisis in the next 5, 6, 7 months are.
One more question here. Yes.
Yeah, just if you could briefly address the role of the military in the economy. I didn't see any defense statistics, defense spending in your charts there, and I wonder if you could just give us a little bit background on that.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. We'll take another round of questions in a moment. So since we don't get lost in them after Dr. Kandil answers these, we'll take some more in a moment. So.
All right. The first question was about jobs and unemployment and reform of subsidies. And in terms of reform of subsidies, particularly fuel subsidies, that have started getting a lot of attention. And I think the political support for that does exist. I think the public is very much supportive of the idea of trimming the waste, because 75% of what has reached almost 100 billion Egyptian pounds is going to those who do not deserve it. So I think everybody is supportive of that. The issue is the implementation. And the concern also is how to protect services so you would not create a wave of inflationary expectations. For example, you need to protect transportation, maybe taxi drivers also, because it's a form of employment. A lot of things that are dependent on the cost of transportation could be affected. So you need to put in place a system to mitigate what could be adverse results. And I think this is what they're working on. But it has to be gradual. We're very far from where the prices should be. And in an inflationary environment such as Egypt, I would argue that you need to scale it down gradually, not aggressively. And you need also to target the products. Not all the products are used equally by different groups. For example, you have 3 grades of gasoline. You can easily say, let go of the subsidy for the premium grade, and then subsidize more the lower grade. So you can start differentiating based on the product and the beneficiaries of these products. But I can tell you that this should be instituted soon. There is a political drive for it, and it's not something that the government, even the transition government, is shying away from handling, but it's a matter of time to reach the execution stage. In terms of unemployment and jobs and whether I think the SME could create the kind of jobs, I think if you look, you're absolutely right. Usually big firms hire at a faster rate. But if we assume that we have 80% of these small, 80% of the economy is in the form of small enterprises, and if we give each one of these enterprises an opportunity to add 1 or 2 jobs, you multiply by 80%, you have a wider impact. Yes, they are not going to hire at the magnitude you would see in large firms, but nonetheless, it would create a big impact. I'm saying this because it's the only realistic environment in the current environment we're seeing. We're not going to get big investors back yet, but I think we can think that they would come back. And I think the point that I would like to make about the Egyptian economy, and maybe I did not want to create a lot of gloom. I think many of us were more optimistic post the revolution and remain more optimistic about the outlook for the economy going forward. I think it's how to cross the bridge and how to make it shorter so it would not be so turbulent. But the outlook for the economy in terms of its ability to attract even more investment, the fundamentals of the economy are strong. The infrastructure was not badly damaged during the revolution. You have young population that provides a lot of room to grow consumption, resilient consumption, and attract investment. You have a strategic location that could be very attractive to many investors. So the strength of the economy is there. You need to secure stability. Stability is what's missing. So it's a short-term phenomenon. But if you cross this, you're going to come back to a better future. In terms of foreign aid is factored in terms of what the government receives. So it goes into the budget. It's part of the revenue. It's called grants or transfers. It's also showing in the data that we have in the financial account. That is also part of the transfers that the government receives, public transfers that the government receives, and it's recorded. So to the extent that there is $1.3 billion or more, $2 billion coming from the U.S., for example, to Egypt, that would be recorded in the current account. So it's a way of boosting international reserves, and it's also a way of reducing the pressure on the budget because you have revenues, and these revenues probably are categorized. They have to go into certain bins, but nonetheless they are revenues. So that reduces the fiscal constraint. In terms of the $3 billion, there was a question about the financial crisis.
The question was what you think the prospect
of getting the $3 billion from the IMF.
Well, if they don't get it, what do you think? I mean, do you think Egypt's in really big trouble if they don't get the $3 billion from the IMF? 1 and 2, regardless whether they get it or not, or both scenarios for them facing a financial crisis, balance of payments or fiscal crisis by early spring next year.
It's a good question. It's a difficult question. Yes, given what we see right now in the absence of this loan and in the absence of any other form of external assistance, it could be a difficult situation. And that because I've already mentioned the benchmark indicator that we look to, which is the international reserves, it's down to 22 billion US dollars. This is close to about 4 months of imports. And it's already a good environment for speculators to step in and start creating a lot of speculative demand. So this is going to create a lot of pressure on the central bank. So it's either that you let go of the exchange rate, which could be very problematic because it would create a wave of inflation in this environment, or you could look for whatever sources of international support to boost your international reserve position. And I think that the deal from the IMF, I was very much against the fact that we rejected it to begin with, but now we're coming back to it. And it seems to me that this is what we need, not just because of its magnitude, the $3 billion, and it's badly needed. I think it's because of your bigger point. It would serve as a way of catalyzing confidence in the economy, that we're bringing the economy back on track. It's a seal of approval because presumably when the IMF does this, it means that they look through the details and they see a way out. So that, along with the political stability, would help bring stability back and would help bring investors back. So that would be a good way of catalyzing more stability going forward. I hope that the regime would be imminent, and I hope that stability would be imminent. If we continue on the same course, I think maybe a new government would be forced to enter into a full-fledged program with the IMF. And that's usually what happens if you get yourself cornered. But that would not mean a good scenario for Egypt, because it would mean more enforced measures of austerity on the economy. So I'd rather that the government would develop its own homegrown austerity measure or program or a blueprint to ease the tension. And I think I've given some suggestions for what I think is doable. I don't think the situation is as critical or as disastrous as the way we see it in Greece and other European countries that have become cut out from the international market. I think Egypt can still borrow, but it cannot afford to borrow, and it's better not to borrow. That's my point. And I think there is room to squeeze spending and reform public finance and grow the private sector so we would not be cornered in this situation. The role of the military in the economy. I've seen estimates from 20% to 40%. Some people think that military owns about 20% of the economy. Some people think that it could be high as 40%. How did this happen? They've been receiving a lot of foreign aid, and it's a powerful institution. It's well financed, and I think they've diverted the resources into productive activity of the economy, building roads, building infrastructure, even owning factories, producing products such as food products. They are known to be efficient. They are known to be very disciplined. The buzz that I'm hearing in Egypt is not the concern about the size of the military in the economy as much as the intentions of the military in terms of safeguarding their political gains going forward. I think the suspicion level has arisen regarding their intention to leave power and when to leave power and what kind of mandates they would like to put in place in order to secure that their rights would be protected going forward. So I think that's the level of suspicion going forward. I hope, I subscribe to the fact that they have not shown interest in governing. I think they would have acted and behaved differently if they were interested in governing. So clearly they want to get out, but they want to get out with the maximizing or protecting their interests, particularly in the democratic environment that could work against them. I don't know. I think it's a big risk for the political process. That's the tension that has started to build up, and I hope it would be eased soon, that there will be some compromise whereby they can safeguard their interests without alienating other political parties and players regarding their suspecting their intentions in the press.
Can I ask just how hidden or sequestered is the military part of the budget? I mean, you're speaking about it like it's a mystery to you. So
No, it's not a mystery. I said the size in the economy, it's a different story. In the budget, you can track this. You can see how much money is being spent on national defense, on security, and it's not a whole lot of money.
you can't see how much they're bringing in? Is that what you're saying?
No, how much they're bringing in terms of foreign aid, that is no.
No, of course, no. But in productive, I mean, their factories,
No, this is not part of the state budget. This would not be a part of the state budget because that would be considered an enterprise, and whatever profits they have, if there is a deal to transfer part of these profits to the state budget, that would be the extent.
But the civilian part of the government will not be able to oversee that part of the economy. That's what I'm wondering.
No, they have. It's an independent budget, and the independent budget gets the allocation, and based on the allocation, they manage the resources. If there are any profits, they retain these profits or reinvest in these profits. That's how they've been operating. So they don't have any mandate to transfer the profits over to the extent that they are profitable to the state budget. But they get allocation from the budget, from the state budget, but it's not a whole lot because they are more dependent on foreign aid than on state budget.
Just on this issue, and you can tell me if you agree with me, I mean, because I've also seen the figures, estimates anywhere from 10 or 12% to 40%. And I guess just 2 points about that. One, as an Egyptian consumer, somebody, you know, on the street buying things and so on, and knowing something about the Egyptian economy, many of those figures seem to be incredibly exaggerated. Right? That's the first point. I mean, I think there's no way that you could imagine that 40% of the Egyptian economy is controlled by the military if you're, you know, buying things in the store and walking around in Egypt and so on. Right?
Yeah,
That's the
I
first
agree.
point. The second point, however, is that even if it's 8% or 7% or 6% of the entire Egyptian economy, that's a huge percentage for something to be controlled by the military and something to be not known, really. And the last point is, and maybe I'm wrong, and if I'm wrong, I'm going to run to my office computer and try to figure out the data. It's my understanding that even the parliament didn't have the figures regarding the military budgets over the last year. So is that correct, or do you have is there some way to get at what the percentage of the budget is for military?
No, that you can get.
That you can get.
That you can get. It's in the state, but to the extent that they get the allocation, that you can get. I think what you cannot track is what you referred to earlier. These are all guess estimates.
Right.
And people have exaggerated this because of the political situation we're in. Nobody was talking about the role of the military, except in a positive way, I must say, about how efficient they are. They build bridges, they build this, and they produce this, it's cleaner this, and it's... So they've been applauded and praised for many, many efficient operations. It's because the level of suspicion has focused now on their political intention that they started to think what other leverage they have in the process. And then they started saying, oh, they own a lot of the economy. But I think this is exaggerated. And even if it's 10% or 15%, what's wrong with that? As long as they play the game by the rule, meaning that they abide by a constitution whereby they are under the control of the legislative process and they are transparent about their operation. But if they're using it to maximize their gain and then play a game with the political system, this is when the level of suspicion has increased and started wondering, can we afford to enter a game with them if they are that powerful? They basically can shut down the economy. That's the counter.
To mention if the labor force working in the factories and the farms in the military industries and so on are making 65 pounds a month, right? That might be the reason for the efficiency. Okay, so a couple of questions in the back. Yes, Dr. Rufai.
Can you elaborate on that 12% increase in the tax revenue? Where is it coming from? Another thing too, is it possible to reform the tax laws in Egypt? How long is it going to take? Can it be implemented? Take into account that you say that 60% of the people are below the poverty limits?
That's a separate question from the tax question.
No, but you're looking, who are you going to collect the taxes from?
Oh, okay. In terms of tax collection and revenues and, okay.
We had a question back here.
Yes. I'm not specialized in your area, but I think a combination of subsidies and tax reform, a good combination that will cover everything and at the same time won't scare investors.
Yeah.
So I don't know what constitutes things like that, because there are many areas other than food that are subsidized and won't hurt the poor people.
Okay.
Okay, we had a question here and then here. Yes.
We know, of course, about Malaysia, Turkey, Brazil. These are countries that they were in big trouble economically and they improved so much. Do you believe that there's certain experience of one of these countries or more that the Egyptian people or Egyptian economists can study and try to copy and follow and get some really good results? That's one question.
Okay. Last one in this round. Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to build on this question, the tax question, in terms of the idea that you mentioned earlier, capital flight. There's been a lot of capital flight. So, how much of that is tax evasion, basically tax people realizing, okay, now we've got to pay our taxes for real. We're either really going to pay our taxes, and then that's why you have that increase, or we're going to get the money, the capital out of the country. And how much of that is a problem of it coming to places even like the United States, where there's not proper evaluation by the banks, know your customer type rules in order to prevent politically exposed persons or others who may be involved in some kind of tax evasion. Is that a problem that you see in Egypt, and may that be fueling some of this capital flight?
We'll stop here so there aren't too many questions for
Okay.
now.
Okay. In terms of the tax reform and the 12%, I think it's because of compliance. An actor like Adel Imam was reported to pay a lot more taxes this year. I don't think he was a lot more productive this year than last year, but I think it's just his advisors have advised him that you're under scrutiny, it's not the right environment for tax evasion. So it's just these stories about allegations and going after corruption and so forth that have increased the level of compliance. Is there a scope to reform the tax system? It has been talked about it, and I've already mentioned that it used to be 20% is the highest category, and now they've instituted another layer, 25% that applies to those who make 10 million Egyptian pounds or more. The discussion about progressive taxes has taken the center stage, again in the name of social justice. People say, how come? And we do not need to attract investors here by offering them a tax haven when they can get tax credit and they can go and instead of paying the rest of the money, the remaining of the 40% to their home country, let's increase the tax on investors. If they're coming for other reasons, not necessarily because of the tax incentive. I subscribe to that. If they're coming for other reasons. But do we have the other reasons? Do we have the good environment now to attract investors so we can go bold on them and say taxes should be raised because you are interested in investing in Egypt for a variety of reasons? I think if we reach that stage, I would advocate raising the tax rate. But for now, I'd be concerned about it. I would suggest to focus on other venues to collect taxes. They've talked about the value-added tax, although it could be inflationary, but it could be a way of boosting the revenues for the government. I've talked about real estate taxes, which I think it's a way of moving a lot of idle capital that does exist. So there are other venues to reform the tax system, and most likely we'll come back to progressive taxes, but let's wait on it till the economy recovers. In terms, your point, Dr. Adel, I think what I've tried to say throughout the presentation is basically the model that you're advocating.
Yeah.
That in order for the government to keep up with its commitments, they need to have a two-track approach. One is reforming the tax system because currently they are not collecting enough revenues. Relative to GDP, we're not doing well in an international context. So there is a room to grow revenues, and that's the way to go. And at the same time, they need to ration spending. And rationing spending means targeted subsidies. They need to have more space to avail more subsidies for those who need subsidies. But they are spending way too much in the form of untargeted subsidies for people who do not deserve these subsidies. So they need to ration spending in order to create that. So these are the two parallel tracks that the government needs to institute. So I think you hit it right on the nail in terms of trying to target the subsidies and at the same time reform the tax system. In terms of international experience, I think the models that you mentioned about Turkey, about Malaysia, have been talked about quite a bit as examples to follow. I'm one of the people who would like to think that each experience is very rich on its own, but at the end, what's good for the economy is what is coming out of these specific conditions in Egypt. I think if you look at these experiences, these are experiences of economies that have liberalized, that have mobilized particularly small and medium enterprises, that provide a lot of similarity to the Egyptian economy, particularly the Turkish experience in terms of the role of religion, in terms of the large population, in terms of the skills of the labor. And to the contrary, I would argue that Egypt has more resources than Turkey. It has more skills and more resources, natural resources than Turkey. Nonetheless, because Turkey has built the reform model anchored on one angle, which is accession to the European Union, which never materialized. Despite the fact it never materialized, they ended up benefiting a whole lot in terms of reforming the economy. So after the economy was tanking, now they are attracting investment. That's the model, the Turkish model. They don't have the resources, But they bring investment, they couple this with the right structure, and then they export. So they built an export empire, including to Egypt, by the way. A lot of Turkish goods are flooding the Egyptian economy, and they are bought and consumed. And Turkey has been the first to try to capitalize on the Arab Spring by going around and trying to open up even more gates with the Arab countries because they know they stand to benefit the more. So that's the kind of model that we should be building. When we look at our trade with Turkey, they are exporting 4 times to Egypt compared to what we export to Turkey. So they stand to benefit the more, but it shouldn't be the case. They bring their FDI to Egypt because they capitalize on relatively less expensive labor and then export from there. So that's the kind of model. It's all about managing your resources, and I think it's a good model to follow. In terms of your point about capital flight is taking place for a variety of reasons, the biggest of which is the concern about really what is likely to happen, about the stability of the economy, about the fact that there could be changes in laws, including the tax law. So your point about tax evasion is well taken, but I wouldn't say it's the #1 drivers of the capital flight. Clearly, people have become so concerned about stability for a variety of reasons, and if they think it's time for them to get out, liquidate, they will do whatever they can. They will take advantage of the fact that it's a liberalized environment because they would be concerned that it could be even more problematic for them to get their money out down the road. So in this environment of suspicion and uncertainty, this is how people try to manage and secure the benefits, but of course at the expense of the larger interest of the economy.
Now, we could go on forever, and I certainly don't want to, if we have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Yeah, sure.
Wonderful.
Sure.
So we'll take just a few questions, one of which will be my own. So,
Okay.
Yes, gentleman in the back.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. My question is a little bit on one of your recommendations with regards to developing SMEs, and I think there's 2 sides of the equation. One is the financial access piece, which is can you actually get loans? And then the second is on the supply side of finance, which is making sure that bankers actually want to invest in SMEs because they are risky.
Mm-hmm.
Is there specific recommendations that you have on the demand and the supply side of that equation for Egypt and for Egyptian businesses, especially in light of the fact that we know that fiscal spending is not a good idea?
Yes.
On the macro economy, however, we know that, for example, President Obama in April made a speech saying that the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which is the insurance and risk mitigation arm of the United States, was going to offer up to maybe $2 or $3 billion in the U.S. Are those risk guarantees something that we need to be looking for in order to make the cost of business a little bit less for large enterprises to enter Egypt? Could that help at all? I would be interested in your answer on that overall. And then on the other side of all of this, as you said, Turkey is a great example for us because Turkey has reformed in its quest to become part of the EU. Could aid be used as a way to make reforms or force reforms on a nation that is largely democratic because of a populist movement that has pushed it into the situation that it's in right now? Could some sort of a session be pushed through, or could aid strategy now change in a way that it actually is pushing for those things, especially that we don't have the Mubarak regime in power right now and the concerns that some of that have come with us? Just these ideas.
Okay.
Sure, if I can ask you a question. One very small point of information and the other one a little bit larger. The point of information is I just was wondering if you could clarify what is the logic or rationale for the government not trying to do targeted fuel subsidies? Is it a technical issue, or is it a political constituency issue that is powerful, that is trying to maintain subsidies and so on? That's the small question. The larger question is, if I was on the streets in the Occupy Wall Street movement right now, and I was listening to the remarks that you made today and so on, I would say that many of the things that you've advocated are actually quite similar to the policies that were advocated in the past, with some differences having to do with the focus on education and health and so on. But really what we saw in the period between 2004 and 2009 was growth without human development. And in fact, it wasn't simply that there wasn't equitable distribution of the growth. If we look at the IMF and the World Bank figures, poverty in Egypt increased during this period. Income inequality in Egypt increased during this period. And therefore, if I was one of the Occupy Wall Street people, nothing against them, I would say that what we need is a really different model. But this is basically what you're saying is the old model worked, it just wasn't implemented well. And their criticism would be, you know what, the model doesn't work. And we need a different way forward to really reduce poverty and create jobs and so on. What would be the answer to something like that?
Okay. These are very good questions. First on the SMEs. On the demand side, the demand, I think, everybody is operating with a lot of caution, including SMEs. But I think for them, the demand exists because it's a must. It's not a choice. For big investors, it's a choice. They can afford to be diversified. They can afford to calculate the risk. They would enter at the right time when it's convenient. But for SMEs, because they have been suffering a lot over the years, and because they need to get off the unemployment line, they need to find food on the table, the demand is there. And this is why I think it's a good component to try to stimulate the economy. Your point about the supply is well taken. And I think this is exactly what happened. When you left them up to the market, and banks have become extremely prudent, and for good reasons, because they need to abide by good financial indicators for prudence and that proved to be resilient, but that shut the intermediation function that could be made available to SME. Then that means the market is not going to find its way without some intervention, because the demand is there but it's struggling. The supply is cautious for obvious reasons, so you need someone to intervene in between. What's the model? You could introduce the government as a collateral to try to increase the bankability of the SMEs. You can try to segregate the market by providing a pool of funds only for SMEs. Central banks do not like to tell you that there is a bank where you have a channel to go to SME at a reduced rate and another channel to the regular market. And I think that goes back to your second point about the international support and the guarantees that could be made available. A lot of these guarantees and the support and the pledges have been going in support of SME. I think it's high time to capitalize on this money by saying we have a pool of resources that is earmarked and directed to SMEs. The problem with regular banking is that when you put SME to compete with other alternatives, banks go to other alternatives. And because they have the luxury to sit on 50% of their deposits, they don't care about whatever incentives the government can give them. And they've tried to give them incentives by waiving the reserve requirement on their lending to SME and so forth. It didn't prove to be effective. So you have to have a special entity, a bank, that operates specifically for SMEs, to segregate them from the market, and then introduce the government as a way of easing the constraints on their bankability, at least for a finite horizon, till they make the first walks and they know how to walk, and then they can find their way on their own. So I think you cannot leave it up to supply and demand, and this is what we had before the revolution. In a private-led environment, they left it up to the market and it didn't work out. So we need to intervene in order to increase the efficiency and increase their ability to acquire more funds in this environment. I think you had a point about the reform of the conditionality on the foreign aid. This is not going to fly well. I think this is the worst thing you could do in this environment. Already I hear discussion about foreign aid could be conditioned on other things, such as the political process and democratic, and I'm not quite sure that this is going to sell well. So the worst thing you could do is for foreign aid to be labeled with conditionality. However, it's not a bad idea. I think you have a glimpse of a good idea here, but you need to package it right. What I would advocate, because there is a lot of international support and interest in extending investment to Egypt, that this investment could be anchored on specific reforms For example, if they were to institute investment in specific sectors of the economy, they can say that in order for us to pump in more investment, you need to do this and that and reform this and that. So it would be a way of boosting investment, and it would look like it's a mutual benefit, and you're trying to increase the return on investment by increasing training or upgrading human capital or easing constraints or whatever, or institutional reform. Then it would look like a part of a bigger package of what is considered to be a market-oriented strategy to boost return on investment. I think that would go well, and I would advocate that. I would advocate this as a model of increasing reform. And I think, going back to your comment about the Turkish example, that's probably what they did. It's because they were interested in opening up to Europe, to the larger Europe, that they instituted a lot of reforms that ended up paying well for them. In terms of your point, Samir, regarding the targeted information, you had something about the political.
The subsidies.
Oh, okay,
What's
okay.
the rationale?
Okay.
Is it technical or? Yeah.
I think it's both. Before the revolution, it has been talked about. When I arrived to Egypt before the revolution, I think they talked about reforming the subsidy system. It's one of these things that everybody knows the answers for, everybody knows it's wrong, everybody knows the solution. It has been researched over and over. There's no creativity involved, but it's the power to execute. The political system before the revolution shied away from addressing this because I think the succession plan dominated, and there were lots of political bribes that needed to be given in many directions, at the business people level, in the government officials level, and at the level of the masses. I think they did not want to be perceived as taking away what is considered to be right before the election. I think it was talked about it, the election that I'm talking to about the parliamentary election back in December of 2010. I think the indication then that let's wait till after the election, and most likely they would press ahead with the subsidy reform. I think it was a lost opportunity for the transition government not to be more aggressive about it once they took over. I think they should have been bolder in my judgment regarding the need to reform it, and even it's going to take some time from a technical point of view, and I'm sympathetic, but at least they could have set the stage for what is likely to come. I think now they are increasing the drumbeat in this direction. I think what they tried to confront for a while, I think now it has become more accepted from a political point of view. But it's the technical aspect of it that's going to take some time, to try to institute the right modalities, to try to mitigate the effects on the economy, to try to protect the vulnerable group, to establish an alternative system. Most likely it's going to entail to some cash transfers for those who opt to take this system. So this is likely to be the case. Then your bigger question is about, the cynical question about if I were sitting here, and I think this is not an Egypt-specific question. It's around the globe, and everybody has looked at the result of capitalism and all these demonstrations going on, and the concentration of wealth, the disparity indicators that have widened around the world. What are the alternatives? Let's talk about the alternatives. One alternative, if we go back to the Egypt-specific, that you could say, over 60 years, Egypt went from extreme left to extreme right. Is there a way in between? So we had socialist and nationalism, and nationalization, and all this state-owned whatever. Then we moved to a model of complete liberal capitalist environment and protecting business people. I think the alternatives are two in my mind. If we become cynical about the capitalist system because it's too greedy and it increases disparity and it clusters the wealth and it's not just, then it's either you go back to the nationalization and state-owned enterprises. I don't think it's efficient. You have to evaluate the experience even of Egypt in this regard. And because we started by saying that there are so many efficient public enterprises that still exist, we cannot go back to that. I think we've created many, many problems that we're still suffering from in terms of the guaranteed right to work and growing the public sector beyond proportion. So I don't think we can afford to go back to this route. But what I'm hoping this current debate would create around the world, that people should realize that this environment of growing private incentives, in order for it to work and work for the public good, you have to have good regulations. And this is what has been missing in the many, many experiences where it went to an extreme and it did not, you could not align the benefits and the interests of the private players in the big structure. So when I try to advocate that we need to reform the system in Egypt, I'm very clear, because the case of Egypt is easier for me, because it was a system that was built to benefit 20% of investors. They clustered the money. You can easily say, you 20% will have a level playing field, and I'm going to pay attention to the forgotten 80% and have a proactive approach within the same structure. So it's a matter of aligning or realigning the rules, so it would not be too much in favor of some at the expense of others. But you need to preserve the pillars of the system, because the other alternative, going back to socialism, nationalism, you shrink the pie. If the pie was not distributed right, you don't want to make it smaller in order to slice it evenly. I think you need to make it bigger, but somehow distribute the pieces in a more just way. And again, investing in people, jobs, employment is the way to go. And the only way to do this is through building a healthy private sector and instituting good regulations.
Well, Dr. Kandil, I'd like to thank you for a wonderful,
Thank you very
informative,
much.
presentation. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Samer and everyone. I've enjoyed your interaction very much.